Hello and welcome to the Discover History YouTube channel, and tonight I'm going to take a look at how people used to spot aircraft either before the Second World War, during the Second World War, and even after the Second World War. Now, what we're really talking about really is an organisation that was known as the Observer Corps. Now, the Observer Corps really started in 1925. However, its origins can actually date back a little bit earlier as well. And that's really down to the fact that when we have the Great War, there is a large amount of air power being used. And what you have to remember is aircraft was originally used for reconnaissance purposes, as they were higher up than a man on a horse, as they famously said. Then they were used for attacking each other. So you have, for example, the dogfights fighting each other in the sky. And then as the war went on, you then get bomber aircraft. And then right at the end of the war, you actually get aircraft supporting troops on the ground as well. So you can see how since the start of flight to the Great War, which is a short period of time really, there was a lot of changes, mechanical changes, tactical changes, and so on. And it drew a lot of attention by, or shall we say, drew a lot of attention from normal people with an interest in planes. And even in the modern day, people have an interest in aircraft. That's why the air shows, for example, are so popular, and people want to learn how to fly. So really, in the post-war Britain, post-First World War Britain, people started to get really interested in aircraft, and there was a lot of organisations and clubs that were formed. And in 1925 they formed the Observer Corps, and the Observer Corps was an organisation where people would spot aircraft, and it was very much recruited, or most of the recruits that joined really came from young boys really, and that was down to the fact that even today, if you think about it, there was a lot of boys interested in aircraft, and they found the speed of them, the height they went up, and that was really interesting. And a lot of these children, as we say, would have got magazines like the Aeroplane Spotter or the Spotter magazine, and they also purchased books. We have a couple of them here. These are the famous ones that were done by Penguin. And Penguin Books brought out several of these aircraft recognition books, and these were constantly changing, almost annually really, purely because aircraft design was changing all the time. And this is a very early one, it's an original one. There was a volume 1 revised, as you can see. There was quite a few of these that were constantly changing, as I mentioned, and there was also another one. That's only 3 that I actually own, but there would have been a lot more. And really, I'm trying not to mention World War II, because you have to remember the Observer Corps was formed before that, and it was mainly an organisation where people would come together with an interest in aircraft. And the interesting thing is, children were taught, especially in those books, how to spot an aircraft by looking at certain characteristics. And in that book, it actually says you should remember the word, or the mnemonic, wet fur. So WETFUR, and each letter actually stands for something. So if you take the aircraft recognition book, and you look up how to spot aircraft, it will say in there that W stands for wings. So it's advisable to look at the wings, and there's a lot you can learn from the wings. And if you learn that certain planes have a certain wing, it will enable you to identify them. So W, wings. E stands for engine, and what you have to remember, this doesn't just mean the shape of the engine, how many engines it's got. You also need to think also about the noise the aircraft makes. Certain engines, especially certain engines from certain countries, do actually make a different noise. T stands for tail, and it sounds odd, but there are different types of tail on an aircraft, even modern aircraft really. And then we go to the F, which stands for fuselage, so the main body of the aircraft, fat, thin, and so on. U stands for the undercarriage, which is basically the bit that the plane sits on when it's on the ground. So is it a retractable one? Do they go up and down, for example, or are they fixed? And then finally, radiators, etc. And that's how it's wrote in the book. It's radiators, etc. So I like to call that one really the miscellaneous, anything else that's not covered by the wet fur. So wings, engine, tail, fuselage, undercarriage, miscellaneous, basically radiators, etc. And children and adults in the Observer Corps would have initially learned how to spot aircraft using those categories, really. And then, interestingly, in 1939, when we go to war against Germany, we actually have quite a state-of-the-art air defence system, which includes things like radar, it includes listening posts, and more importantly, large numbers of people that know how to spot and identify aircraft, the Observer Corps. And the Observer Corps in the early days had no uniform whatsoever. Interesting fact though, they did have rifles issued to them, and that's mainly because they are like to get shot at, so they can shoot back or return fire. And they also had a tin helmet and also a service respirator. And most of them actually had a duty armband as worn by the police. Instead of wearing it on the forearm as the police do, it was often worn on the forearm at the top there, and it was basically a stripy armband, often embroidered over the top with the red lettering of Observer Corps. Interesting fact also, they sat in deck chairs and they tapped into the phone line, and they were usually up high, and their job would have been looking to the heavens. It was all part of the air defence. You have to remember about radar, it only works accurately over the sea. So when the aircraft or German aircraft come across the channel and they're then over Britain, our air defence system relies on people looking to the sky. So the Observer Corps went all the way through the war. After the Battle of Britain in 1940, they were given royal status, so they became known as the Royal Observer Corps, and they also received a very similar uniform to the RAF. They became part of the Royal Air Force, and then post-war, they went over to plotting fallout, for example, during a nuclear strike, if there was ever a nuclear strike on Britain. And interesting fact, even though they started before the war, starting in 1925, they actually went on till 1995. So they're really the longest serving civil defence force in Great Britain. Anyway, we're really concentrating on that period of pre-war and during the war. So remember what WET first stood for. Imagine you're a child that is very, very interested in aircraft, and you've become a member of an aircraft club, a spotting club. You get the Spotter magazine and you're just learning different types of aircraft. So in your head now, you should have that mnemonic, WETFUR, WETFUR. Wings, engines, tail, fuselage, undercarriage, and final one, radiators, etc., miscellaneous. So here's a few examples to show you. These are not specific aircraft from the Battle of Britain. These are a selection of German aircraft. So here we have an aircraft spotting chart showing 3 views of the same plane. You get a lot of these during the war. You would have usually a view from an aircraft coming towards you, a view from what it looks like underneath, so as it flies over your head, sometimes a side view, but you generally get a view of the aircraft at an angle, which is the usual view you'll get if you're up high, for example, on a church tower or on a hill. Now, this is famously the Junkers 87, so the Stuka dive bomber. And I'm using this one to talk about W, which is wings. So you have to look at the wings. And as I mentioned briefly, some wings are square tipped, as we see here. Some of them are angular in shape. You also have to think about where the wings are on the aircraft itself. Do they fit into the fuselage? Do they sit below the fuselage? Or, for example, in a Lysander, is the wing attached to the top above the cockpit, for example? So you have to look at that. So if you're looking at that aircraft specifically, you might want to remember this aircraft because it is often described as having seagull-like wings and square tips. So that's a good way of remembering the W, wings, part of your WETFUR. Which then takes us on to E. So E is engine. And remember what I said, you need to think about the noise of the engine. A lot of German aircraft had a hum to it, which often terrified people in the air raid shadows. They usually knew the difference between a British and German plane by the sound. But then you've got to look at what type of engines are they. Are they, for example, single engine? Is it like a fighter, for example? Has it got 2 engines, twin engine, 4 engines, for example? And where are they placed on the wing? If you think of some aircraft, they may even have 3 engines, like the Junkers 52. But this one is a German bomber, the Junkers 88. And as you can see, this is a twin engine bomber. So it's got 2 engines attached to it, and they are located close to the fuselage on the wing, just to there. So remember, we're going through wet fur. So that then takes us on to T, standing for tail. For this, I'm using the Messerschmitt 110 or 110. And this one shows a very different tail. Some have a very simple tail. Others have a 2-finned tail, as in this case. And most famously, the British bomber, the Lancaster, has 2 fins attached to the tail. So you have to recognise these individual little traits with different aircraft. So you will remember 1 or 2 little facts about them. You don't have to name them fully, but just as long as you can remember, for example, if a certain one has a wing attached above the cockpit, if it has 2 engines, for example, or even to the point that you're thinking the noise of that plane is very specific. So you're trying to identify, and this is what these Observer Corps or later Royal Observer Corps used to do. We then go on to fuselage, and this is a Dornier 217, and you have to look at this one, and this one I'm relating to F for fuselage. And actually, one of the earlier versions of the Dornier was very, very thin, which gave it a nickname, the Flying Pencil. So you would look at the fuselage, is it fat, is it thin, and that might be another characteristic to help you identify it. So wings, engine, tail, fuselage, which then brings us on to undercarriage. The undercarriage really is the wheels underneath. That's what we're talking about. And this is a Junkers 52, so a transport and also an aircraft used for delivering paratroops, for example, the Fallschirmjäger. And this has a fixed undercarriage, so the undercarriage is permanently out. Some of British aircraft was the same. Even if you think back to the Junkers 87 dive bomber, the Stuka, that had fixed undercarriage. But most of them, like a lot of the planes that I've also showed, even the famous Spitfire used by Britain or the Commonwealth troops, that has an undercarriage that goes into the body when it takes off. So what is the undercarriage like? Is it noticeable that it's got a fixed undercarriage? And then finally, we've got radiators, etc. This is the miscellaneous, really. And the best way of looking at that is looking at this Heinkel 111. And for this one, you might want to say it has a large glass bubble on the front, or you may want to say it has a tail gun, or it may have an upper gun or a lower gun. It's little things like that which will aid all the other things, pile it all together into one big mass, and that will help you identify the aircraft. Maybe not by name, but you may identify it as being friend or an enemy, for example. So books like these were very, very popular. They were popular before the Second World War broke out. They were popular by all the spotters, the magazines that came out as well. And when war broke out, luckily Britain had this army of people that would look to the skies and spot aircraft. And it was vitally important. And like I said, after the Battle of Britain, they were given royal status, and they carried on right up to 1995, a long-serving civil defence force. So that's been a little bit of an introduction. So we've got a question for you. Is there anyone out there that, number one, likes aircraft? If you do, what is your favourite aircraft from World War II? Is it a Spitfire? Is it a Hurricane? Is it a Junkers 52? Is it a Stuka dive bomber maybe? And remember, we don't have to just look at British and German aircraft. You can look at American aircraft, you can look at Japanese. So all I want you to do is comment on here, and when it goes onto Facebook, Twitter and Instagram, let us know what you think or what you prefer as your favourite aircraft. Let us know. But hopefully you've learned a little bit about Britain's air defence and the fact that we had a good system, especially with the Observer Corps and later Royal Observer Corps. We had a very good system before the war actually breaks out in 1939. Anyway, on that note, stay in, stay safe, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.